Okay, welcome everyone to another lesson from Mr. Baxley for Como-Pickton and Northeast Texas Community College. This is a video over Chapter 5 from our textbook, The Mosaic of 18th Century America, 1689 to 1768. So, I will be honest with you, the last video was very long. This video ideally should be shorter. However, what this chapter is about is it says the mosaic. The mosaic. A mosaic is when you have a picture made of lots of tiny little pieces. Usually you think about like a mosaic like being made out of stone or of glass. And so what it's getting at there is this chapter is all about all the different people that lived in North America from 1689 to 1768. And so this chapter has a wealth of information about New Spain, California, New France, Louisiana, etc., etc. I'm going to talk about some of it, and then I'm going to skip to the English. I want you to read about those sections in your textbook, but what is going to be more heavily tested is the stuff about the English, so that's what we're going to focus on today. Now, what we are going to talk about is Texas. We live in Texas, so I feel like it's a good thing to talk about Texas. Texas is formerly settled by the Spanish during this time period, largely as a buffer against the French. So last week we talked about how the French were settling along the Mississippi River, and this chapter talks about them settling New Orleans and their settlements in New France becoming more densely populated. So Texas is kind of established as a buffer against the French, where the Spanish say, no more, France, you can't have Texas. And so Texas has a bunch of missions set up along San Antonio, in the San Antonio area and like El Paso. One interesting wrinkle that we're going to talk about is this, as a result of the contact between the Eastern and Western hemispheres, we see Native Americans begin to adopt horses, okay? And the Comanche are a tribe of Indians that would not have been successful the way that we think of them today without contact from Europe. They take wild horses that have been abandoned by the Spanish, Mustangs, and horses that they acquired from Europeans that had, a lot of horses had just kind of run loose and thrived in North America. And the Comanches and other Indians like them took to riding horses, taming horses for themselves, and it kind of transformed their whole culture. And so the Comanche, they called themselves the Numunu, which meant the people, but Comanche was actually a mean name that other Indians gave to the Comanche, okay? And so it was not a nice thing to say, and that's kind of the idea is that other Indians told Europeans about the Comanches, and they used their word for the Comanches, which is kind of like if aliens came to the earth and they found like the most racist person they could and accidentally said, will you please explain to me the world? And then they just started using racial slurs to refer to different people. And then the aliens like wrote that down as like the names of different groups of people in America. That's kind of where we get our word Comanche. It's not a nice name, but it's the name that stuck in the minds of Europeans. Anyways, but the Comanches are just one of many Native American groups that begin to use horses, and it dramatically transforms their culture as nomadic hunters. It makes it much easier for them to hunt the buffalo, do things like that. But that's all we're going to talk about there. Read that section of the chapter, read the stuff about the Spanish, read the stuff about the French, read all that stuff, and now we're going to talk about this little map right here. So this is a fuzzy map, but there is a clear version of it on page 105 of your textbook. And you can see the Louisiana territory claimed by the French and the Canadian areas claimed by the English. You can see the areas of Quebec claimed by the French, the 13 colonies. You can see Spanish Florida, Spanish Texas, Mexico, and the Southwest. And you can see the areas that were under dispute and the locations of several important settlements, okay? And it also shows you the important Native American tribes and their locations. So that is a good map to study to kind of get a sense of the status of North America leading up to the big kerfuffle of the French and Indian War. okay? Because that's what this chapter is all about. This chapter is getting us from the early colonies to French and Indian War, which changes everything, okay? So with that in mind, let's talk about the English colonists, okay? So by 1600, by the mid 1700s or so, the English colonies have stabilized and they are growing. And immigration and natural increase in the population is leading to a boom in the population of North America. But also, after the huge plagues that wiped out large amounts of Native Americans, the global population rises once again. And we see a lot of this because of the exchange of food. Potatoes, tomatoes, yams, those sorts of plants are brought to Europe and Asia, become very popular and increase the amount of calories and vitamins and diversify the diets across the world. And we see a large growth in the amount of people in the world. As the population of North America, and specifically the 13 colonies, grows, there is more and more need for land, and further and further west settlement moves, okay? And this country is called the back country. You see, if you look at a map of the United States, the 13 states on the eastern side, most of them end in the area of the Appalachian Mountains. And the Appalachian Mountains were a barrier to settlement. They were not as easy to live on. It was rougher terrain and less desirable. The first comer, the people who came to the New World first, they wanted the nice coastal plain land that was more fertile, that was easier to get to the ocean and trade back and forth with England. And people didn't really want to go into the backcountry. But as more and more immigrants are coming into the into the 13 colonies, the land that is available is in the backcountry, in the mountains, and the people that tend to go there tend to be the newest generation of immigrants and the people that are less well off financially. These are the rougher sorts of people from England. We start to get less and less of the proper English group of people and more of groups of Scotch, Irish, and Welsh. You get a lot of German and even some Dutch immigrants in these kind of backcountry areas. Okay, the Scotch Irish, that's Scottish and Irish, kind of a mixture of those two people. They are the ones that are very rough around the edges. Okay, they don't have the same sort of ideas about society and politeness and gentility that is more well known in England. And within the British Isles, these are the people that, you know, in ancient English history, these are the people that the English fought for control over the British Isles, okay? You know, at one point in time, back in the Roman era, when the Romans conquered England, they built a wall called Hadrian's Wall to keep the Scottish people out because they were wild people, you know, and, you know, back in those times, you know, they'd paint themselves blue and run around chopping people up like they were nuts. They were crazy. And so the English have always had this kind of view that the Scottish people are just kind of loose cannons, okay? And so who better to let loose on the tough and rough terrain of the backcountry than these rough and tough people, okay? And so the English, they encourage those groups of people to settle on the backcountry and tame it. And once things get settled down, then they start to move and purchase that land from them. And then the immigrants, the new wave of immigrants comes in, they push a little further west. This also, the English are pretty okay with this because these are the people that tend to be on the frontier dealing with the harshest of the conflicts with Native Americans. Again, the English are like, yes, we've got these kind of rough around the edges people. Let's let them deal with this problem. And that's what they do. Okay. This is the beginnings of the Appalachian kind of mountain folk that become, you know, the frontier hard scrabble lifestyle. They tend to live very isolated lives. Okay, where their farms are in, you know, the mountains full of trees, where they're doing subsistence agriculture. They're living very, very hard lives with a lot of hard work and not a lot of wealth and comfort. Okay, but they have, in their isolation, leads to them keeping a lot of their cultural traditions and not melding as much with the English. Okay, they keep their accents, they keep a lot of their music, they keep a lot of their cultural ideals, and their different ways of living life and their different culture from like the English on the coast is the origins, in my opinion. You can look at this as the origins of things like, you know, folk music. You know, the hillbilly people is kind of what the hill folk, you know, the word hillbilly refers to people living in Appalachia, which is not a nice thing to say, but that sort of idea of like what we would another not nice term is redneck. Okay, that sort of culture of what we would more properly say is like Appalachian, you know, mountain people. That culture develops, and we see a lot of modern day, you know, country music and modern day, you know, kind of country sensibilities, like the difference, you know, country people versus city people. You already have this little divide between country and city people already back in the 1700s and 1600s, between these immigrants in the back country and the more, you know, tame settlements on the East Coast. Okay, so we have estimated population by region. I'm trying to go fast to get a lot of this stuff in. You have a really good map on page 117 of kind of where they lived. You know, this right along the Appalachian Mountains, we have these backcountry settlements. Okay, now there are, as more and more people are moving to the Americas, there's more and more ethnic differences, and there's a lot of heightened sectional tensions in, sorry about that, there's a lot of heightened sectional tensions in the Americas because of the differences in ethnicity. The southern part of the 13 colonies has a larger and larger population of African slaves. Kind of the mid-Atlantic colonies, they have a much more diverse population. The northern colonies tend to be more all Puritans or people like Puritans. And so these different groups of people have differences in opinions. And the 13 colonies are not all the same. They're very diverse and they have a lot of disagreements, okay? You see a lot of things, though, in common on the seaports, okay? The cities along the coast tended to be the places where you saw the most prosperity, okay? All the major colonial cities were seaports, okay? And this was the connection to Europe that fueled a lot of the economy in the Americas. From people who cut down trees for lumber in New England and shipped it to Europe, from the plantation owners in South Carolina growing rice and tobacco, and from, you know, farmers in colonial Pennsylvania, you know, hunting and fishing and taking their wares and sending them to Europe and buying stuff back. The seaports were all a connection, okay? All right. You start to see more and more different kinds of people. Even in northern seaports, you see more and more Africans living there. Okay. Women often had more opportunities for diverse ways of living life other than being that, you know, frontier housewife. The frontier women, if you look back here on this slide, frontier women tended to live very difficult lives working alongside the men in their families. And the isolation typically meant that yes, there was a division in labor. You know, there were some tasks that mostly men did, some tasks that mostly women did. But frontier women would plow and would do the same kind of hard work, like heavy physical labor like the men would, okay? And they would contribute quite a bit. In the city, there's opportunities for young unmarried women to get jobs working in, you know, say a fancy person's house as a seamstress, or as, you know, as a maid or as a dressmaker or a midwife. Those sort of occupations could bring a lot of status and wealth to women that they didn't necessarily have that opportunity to out in the farms, okay? Now, city seaports were places of economic insecurity, okay? There was quite a bit of effects from just like the whole world economy going on there. You tended to have a lot more epidemics in the cities, a lot more possibility for fires, okay? And so you start to see some people living in poverty in America's cities, which is something that, is kind of a new thing in the Americas, but it's something that exists in far greater numbers in Europe, okay? And there's a lot of possibilities for economic wealth as well. And you start to see a development of more diverse culture. You start to see, things like theaters, okay? More than just regular old bars, but things like that as well. And there's a lot of possibilities to have entertainment, access to newspapers, things like that you have in the city, which leads to people having more interconnected culture, and the culture develops faster than the people living isolated out on the frontier. People on the frontier, it may be months before they see someone who's not a member of their family. And so any news they get is just a big deal. Maybe, that one trip a month they go to town to trade or to do things, that's like the only contact they have with people that are not their own family. Whereas in the city, there's lots of new ideas and new people and new things to divert your attention. You can see the growth of different cities, okay? So Boston and Charleston, New York, Philadelphia, they're all growing, but Philadelphia is growing very, very fast from 1720 to 1770. Now, we'll talk about slave societies in the 18th century South. This is something that I talked quite a bit about in our lesson for chapter 3. So I'd recommend, if you have not watched that lesson for chapter 3, go back and watch that. But there are different sort of slaveholding societies in the South. The style of slavery in Virginia is much different than the style of slavery in, say, South Carolina and Georgia. Okay, so those two areas, the Chesapeake and the Lower South, have very different ways of dealing with slavery. And a slave's life depended on where they lived. Okay, so the task system versus gang labor were two totally different ways of managing slaves. Okay, so the basically, if you as we move on through from the north to the south, in the Chesapeake, people tended to have less numbers of slaves per person because there were lots of smaller farms. And so it tended to be that the owners would work side by side or more closely with their slaves. In the lower South, the plantations tended to be larger with less white people and more slaves. And so the slaves tended to have more independence in doing their work rather than being side by side with their masters. They would be set up with tasks that they would have to do every day rather than working in a gang with other slaves and the owner kind of making, okay, let's do this job. All right, now let's do this job. Now let's do this job. The task system said, today you have to take care of this field, do these chores, this, and then you're done for the day. The task system was much more impersonal. Okay, so in the Chesapeake, there's a lot more close personal relationships between the masters and their slaves. But in the task system, which is more popular in, say, like the lower South, there's more opportunities for slaves to have a little bit of freedom because their masters give them a task to do. When they get done, they have a little bit of free time where they can do their own sorts of things. And this leads to a difference in the culture between the slaves of the Chesapeake and the slaves of the lower South. The slaves in the lower South tend to retain more and more of their African culture because they tend to live in larger slave quarters with more numbers of slaves, and they have slave communities, and they have a bit more of a society than the more scattered slaves where there's a very few number of them with each of their masters. And so there begins to be more and more slaves born in America, and American-born slaves have a difference in culture from the new slaves being brought in as imports, okay? Now, you start to see the development of like Black families in the South, and you start to see like their culture and their traditions developing into what becomes African-American culture in the United States. There's a very strong oral tradition in African-American culture. And a lot of this goes back to in slavery. Slaves were typically not allowed to learn how to read and write. And so their stories and the way they taught each other and the way they passed their knowledge and their memories and their culture down is through oral tradition, through speaking it and remembering the stories and telling them to others. Okay, you start to see the development of, African-American churches, and you start to see more and more slaves becoming Christians, okay? And there are some people that don't think, like there's some white masters who don't want their slaves to become Christians, but there are many that do. And so you start to see the development of, black churches in America today growing out of a spiritual tradition. And this is one opportunity for slaves to have an advancement in their status, is to become a preacher, to become a minister, and to minister to the other slaves in the plantation. Now, that minister is still a slave, but that is a way for them to have, some change in their status, okay? Now, there is resistance to slavery in North America in the 18th century, okay? And there are quite a few slaves who run away, okay? Slaves, now, no matter how hard some people might try to convince you that slavery wasn't too bad or whatever, it's all bad, okay? It's all bad. At the core, slavery is owning another person and telling a person that they're not a human with rights and liberties, but rather they're an object to be owned and to be, mastered over. Now, slaves, they tended to resist through things like sabotage, slowing down the work, feigning ignorance to frustrate their masters, and taking advantage of any opportunity to do less work and to do, to do anything to make their lives a bit more manageable. Some slaves had outright resistance as runaways, where they completely ran away. And you see these maroon communities of runaways where groups of slaves might gather together and try to create some communities, okay? In 1739, and there are many slave revolts that happen where you actually have full-on revolts. Probably the biggest one is the Stono Rebellion, okay? The largest one, where nearly 100 Africans, led by a slave named Jimmy, seized arms from a store in the coastal district of Stono and killed several white neighbors before they were caught and killed by the colonial militia. Okay? Now, as the system of slavery is more and more codified by law and, stabilized throughout the South, slave rebellions become more and more infrequent. As you see more and more people born into slavery rather than being imported as slaves from Africa, the culture of slavery becomes more and more set in the South, and the laws and everything in the society starts to develop to keep slaves from rebelling. And for most South people living in the South, the white slave owners and non-slave owners, one of the greatest fears that they live with on a day-to-day basis is a slave rebellion. So most of the things that slave owners do are designed to keep their slaves from rebelling, from using physical punishment, like, whipping and beating and torture to keep slaves on task, to keep them working and working and working without any respite, to doing so there's, harshness. And then sometimes there are things that slave owners do, to make things a little bit more bearable, to keep them from full-on rebelling, by letting them have church, by letting them have some of their traditions, letting them play, have like this picture right here of letting slaves have some time to play music and to have a community. But at the same time, in all of these instances, the master is still in control. He can take these slave families and break them up and sell the father to one slave owner, sell the children to another slave owner, and keep the wife or whatever. These families can be broken up. They can be tortured at the drop of a hat. And the life of a slave is being lived at the whim of the master. And so this whole system is designed to keep them under control and to not allow them to have any freedom. So it's a horrible system, but it becomes more and more entrenched in American society as we move forward in time. All right, now, like we talked about in the last chapter, there is a great deal of influence of religion on the foundation of America. Many of the colonies in the North are founded for religious reasons, from Massachusetts to Rhode Island to Pennsylvania, etc., to even Maryland. Most of these colonies kind of happen, Connecticut, etc., happen as a result of either religious conflict or religious groups wanting to find their own place to live. But after around 100 years, religion in the colonies seems to be somewhat in decline, okay? A lot of these Puritan communities that came to the colonies and they're on fire for God and they're just wanting to live these holy lives serving the Lord, they've now become complacent. They've now gotten so mired in their traditions and they're so focused on doing things like making money and building settlements and having colonial governments that they don't have the same deep devotion to God that many communities had right at the beginning of colonial settlement. And more troubling to many Christians is the development of this group called rational Christianity. Okay. Benjamin Franklin, we're going to talk about, hopefully we're going to talk about him a lot. He's a big figure in American history. He's one of many colonial leaders who are devotees of the Enlightenment ideal of human reason. During this period of time, the whole of Europe is going through this period known as the Enlightenment, okay? And the Enlightenment is this period of expansion of thought, okay? Moving away, and it happens kind of as a result of the Protestant Reformation, okay? The Catholic Church had solid rule over Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years. For a long time, anybody that wanted to be educated had to go through basically the process of becoming a priest. If you wanted to go to college, you had to first become a priest because all the colleges in Europe were essentially, training for becoming a priest. And so if you wanted to learn how to like read and write and learn science and things like that, you had to first go through the process of becoming a priest. And many people would actually go through college and like say that they're going to become a priest. When they got done with that part, they'd say, okay, I don't want to be a priest no more, but thanks for the education. And they'd go on with their education and do their own thing. But when the Protestant Reformation happens, the Catholic Church loses their monopoly over knowledge. They lose their monopoly over literacy. We start to see more and more books being printed thanks to Johannes Gutenberg and his printing press. We start to see more and more ability for new ideas to be spread. We see newspapers and pamphlets and articles and books being spread across Europe. And we see a transformation during the Enlightenment as people start to do more and more things, not because of tradition, but because of logic and reason, okay? Rather than doing things the way that we've always done, let's think about ways to do things better than we ever have before. And so the Enlightenment ideal of human reason says that humans can rationally think about things and come up with the best way to deal with to deal with problems. And it involves a lot of revisiting old beliefs, seeing if they're reasonable. If they're not, throwing them away and replacing them with more reasonable beliefs. And so there is this movement among some Christians to move away from some of the traditions of the faith. There is one of these groups become known as, it's not quite agnostic, but there's a group of people, they think of like the clockmaker God or the watchmaker God, where rather than thinking of God as a personal creator who cares for you, they think of God as someone who created the earth, set it in motion like a watchmaker, putting all the cogs of a watch together, starting the clock ticking, and then setting back and just saying, let's see what happens, okay? And so there's people that start to say, well, God had to have existed, but did he really do all the things in the Bible? And there's people that start to move away from the traditional faith. And this leads many ministers and many people of faith in the colonies to be concerned, okay? And they see this as a loss of faith, and this is a danger to the souls of people. If they don't believe, then, they can go to hell. That's what a lot of these ministers are thinking. And if people turn away from their faith and they don't teach their children about their faith, then those children are going to go to hell. And so there is a huge wave of revivals that happen in response to this called the First Great Awakening. In this class, I hope to teach you about several great awakenings. But these are revivals, okay? Religious revivals. So the idea of a revival is something is dead and you bring it back to life. So the spiritual health of the colonies had fallen apart. And so there is a reaction to this in the form of an evangelical revival, okay? Now, this is an old message preached in a new format. The evangelicals are not really adding a whole lot of stuff that is new, but rather they are presenting it in a new style. Does that make sense? They're using the same Bible. They believe the same God. They believe in the same beliefs. The message is still the same, that people are sinners. Jesus died for their sins and paid the penalty of their sin. If you believe in him, you can have that sin taken away and you can go to heaven. The same belief that the Puritans have and most of these churches have, but the evangelicals are very, very focused on converting people, okay? For the Puritans, they believed that, that God picked who was going to get saved and who wasn't. And a lot of the evangelicals believe this too. They're, Calvinist, and they really don't try to get outsiders and bring them in. They kind of focus on their own community and what their community needs spiritually. Evangelicals are outward looking. They take the message from Jesus in the book of Matthew chapter 28, where Jesus says to go out into all the world and to preach the gospel and make disciples, baptize them, teach them the story. So Jesus commanded his disciples in Matthew chapter 28 to go out into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And the evangelicals believe this. They want to evangelize people, to see them transform and to be converted. And so they go out and they preach and they preach and they preach these revival sermons, okay? And there's lots of these people that join the First Great Awakening. There are ministers that were already preaching in, say, Colonial, Massachusetts, that get struck by this idea and they start really being more persuasive. They really start emphasizing the need of people to turn back to God. They start using, new oratory techniques. Basically, the sermons get more exciting, okay? People start to feel the Spirit, okay? And people manifest that Spirit, and they start, things were more exciting rather than the stodgy, cold, formal religious services of the Puritans. In these more evangelical services, you're having people getting up and singing and dancing and moving and shaking and jumping around as they're feeling, the presence of God, they believe, and they're happy and excited about it. And at the same time, there's fear of God's wrath, but there's joy at God's mercy and love. And so this is a much more emotional appeal to people to be converted than the appeals of the Puritans in Massachusetts, okay? And so people, when they go to a First Great Awakening type church, it's exciting. There's all this persuasion happening, and lots of people start turning to the church. They come back. One of the most famous of these people is George Whitefield, okay? He comes to America from England, and he was just electric, okay? He would give these, these powerful, powerful speeches, these messages. He'd have people up on their feet. He was exciting. He was dramatic, and he would enliven his sermons with dramatic gestures, flowing tears, and gruesome depictions of hell, okay? And here's the thing about evangelicalism. It appeals to all classes and ethnicities. The Bible says in Matthew chapter 28 to preach the gospel to every creature. So George Whitefield and people like him, they don't limit their preaching to just people in their church. They don't limit their preaching to just English people or just white people or just anybody, black, white, whatever, English, Indian, doesn't matter. If they're in auditory range of George Whitefield, he's going to preach to them the gospel. And this leads to a massive awakening of Christianity in the 13 colonies. And we see a diversification of religion as more and more people kind of get on this First Great Awakening. There's the old non-Great Awakening churches that are kind of left in the dust, okay? This deepens a lot of the divide among religious factions, but it leads to the growth of groups like the Baptist churches and the Presbyterian churches. Baptists are all about the First Great Awakening. They're really into it, and they're really into going out into the frontier. You see, George Whitefield, he wouldn't stay in one spot. He would tour from city to city, to place, and he would go and he would preach the gospel anywhere he could. Rather than having a church and having people come to him, he went to people. And the Baptists do that. They go out into the frontier to these people that are living in isolated lives, and they are preaching the gospel. they have a lot of success in the South, okay? You see, the South, they didn't have as many churches as the North did. Remember, Massachusetts is like church everywhere. Every little town's got a church. In Virginia and in the Southern colonies, there's not as many churches, and there's not as much influence of religion on their lives. And the people in these colonies, they desire this. They have souls. They want to believe, and they want to, they want to believe, and they want to be converted, and they are fertile ground for the gospel. And all across the South, we see the beginnings of Baptist and Presbyterian churches. And even though they face persecution from others, I mean, there's people that get arrested. There's people that, get into fights over this. They start to have a lot of success, okay? Today, one of the largest organized group of churches in America is the Southern Baptist Association of Churches. And that group originates kind of in this time period where they really have a lot of success. They kind of, the First Baptist Church is in Rhode Island, but the Puritans kind of keep control over a lot of it, and they push outwards. One thing that happens is this idea of revival or camp meetings. A lot of places are so isolated that they don't have the resources to have a full-time church. And so what happens is a preacher comes into an area and says, hey, I'm going to be preaching at this big tent in the middle of the woods for a week. And people, a lot of them didn't have anything better to do. They, just been working and been isolated. Remember, we talked about isolation. They hadn't seen, that most people wouldn't see new people their whole lives. They'd see the same family, the same group of people in the closest town, and their whole life would just kind of be that isolated life. The idea of someone new, even if you weren't religious, just the idea of like seeing new people at a revival would be enticing. And so a lot of these meetings happen, a lot of these revival meetings would happen in outdoor arenas or amphitheaters or just fields in the middle of the woods where someone put up a tent and put down some logs and hay bales, and they got together and they had church in the middle of the woods. And this leads to a growth of religious groups, and especially the Baptists and Presbyterians, and this more revival evangelical focus in the 13 colonies that still exist in a lot of the United States today. Okay, now let's talk about the economy. Okay, as the colonies grow and thrive, they become more and more economically different from England. You see, England had a developed economy that had been established over hundreds of years. England has a lot of cities and it has a lot of farms, but around 2% of the population owned about 70% of the land in England. And so that meant that when it came to, say, like voting, most of the time the voting is only among landowners. There's not very many people who are able to vote in England, even though England is a democracy at this time. Okay, they have a lot of manufacturers, they have a lot of industry, but they have a lot of poor people, and they have a larger working class that is very poor. But at the same time, there's a growing number of people, specifically the people that are wealthy are becoming wealthier. There's a growing amount of wealth in England, and there's a growing amount of people that want to buy stuff. And so the Americas becomes a source of natural resources for England, and the Americas and England, they become partners in trade, okay? Now, there is a lot of more inequality in England than in America. Now, America has a lot of just stark inequality right off the bat from slavery. There are hundreds of thousands of people and eventually millions of people that are slaves. They have no rights, and they have consequently no property. And that is very, very stark inequality. But when you compare the white populations of England and the Americas, there are some interesting differences. Okay, there are very strict delineations in class in England. There is the upper crust, the upper class, where you have the nobility, the gentry, the people who own land and own big businesses and are tradespeople. And those people have all kinds of money. They live in fancy mansions and palaces. They wear, powdered wigs and fancy clothes, etc. Then there is a growing middle class in England, okay, where we have like the merchants and the tradesmen and the shopkeepers, and they are growing and thriving. But most of more than 2/3 of the people in England struggled for survival at the bottom of society. Okay, so you're looking at, a third of England is doing okay, 2% or so is doing really awesome, and then around 2/3 is a struggling. In America, though, about 75% of the colonial white population was among the middle class. You still have poverty, and you still have some people that are super rich at the top. But most people in America most white people in America are just middling landowners or farmers. They've got a farm with a few acres and they're living their lives, and they're not poor, but they're not super rich either. This leads to all sorts of consequences for the ideas in America, okay? There's more people in America that are eligible to vote than they are in England. There's more people in America that have this sense of land ownership, which in England, owning land means that you're super fancy, you're super rich. In America, it's just kind of normal. And so there's this sense of equality among these independent farmers in America that you don't really have in England. And people living in America were fascinated and repelled by English society. They wanted to be fancy English people in some ways. They owned land. They thought, hey, I'm like a noble in England. Someone in America might have a 500 acre plantation and just be a normal person. Whereas if you're in England and you have a 500-acre plantation, you're like one of the richest people around. So people in America were very fascinated by England, and a lot of them bought the same clothes. They wanted to eat the same foods, have parties, and sort of, especially among like the richer sort of people in America, they tried to replicate the English lifestyle. But at the same time, they didn't like English society. They didn't like the corruption. They didn't like the fact that all these rich people kind of controlled everything in England, and most people lived dirty, hardscrabble lives of poverty in English cities, working in English factories and things like that. So the Americans kind of wanted to be like England, but didn't want to be like England, okay? And there still is a fascination in America with England. It's like there's still people today that love English society. They fawn over actors and actresses with English accents, and they think they sound so fancy, and they think, oh, they're so cool, they're English. But at the same time, people in America also, like to make fun of, quirks in English society that they have. We say, oh, they have tea. They're so fancy. At 4:00, they have tea, and they eat crisps instead of potato chips. And there are groups of people in America called Anglophiles, and they're people that are like, obsessed with English culture. And that still exists today. But at the same time, Americans did not like aristocrats. We did not like nobles. We didn't like those people who thought they were better than other people. And this might stem from resentment, because the richest and most wealthy people in America, if they went to England, they would be treated as commoners, okay? The English people, they're just kind of stuck up. They think, oh, we're so much better than those people in the colonies, the riffraff, And someone like a plantation owner in South Carolina might make, tons and tons of more money than someone in England would in their little, colonial, their little English manor. But as far as the society in England cared, just being in England made you far better than anyone in the colonies. People in the colonies were just, riffraff, and that sort of repelled Americans and led to a lot of resentment of English people. And later on in America, when we actually have our own country, when we get our independence, we make it very clear from our Constitution to all of our laws that we do not have an aristocracy. We don't have inherited titles in America. People don't become princes or lords or counts or duchesses or dukes, okay? We don't do that in America. We don't have knights. And that stems from the fact that we like to think in America that everyone is equal. We are a society of equals, and no one can look down on someone else because of their title, okay? And so we really, really dislike those parts of English society. When it comes to When it comes to politics, it's the same way. America loves the idea of English politics, but we hate its practice. Okay, like we like the idea of English culture, but we kind of hate it in practice. England's constitution is very balanced, and the way it's written seems to be a good way of controlling things. You know, for most of human history, we see a lot of absolute monarchies or absolute government, or a lot, sorry, for most of the countries in Europe at this time, not throughout human history, but in this Europe at this time, there's a lot of absolute monarchies where the king can do whatever they want. England, in contrast, has a balance of power between the king, the nobility, and parliament. And within parliament, there is the House of Lords, which represents the nobility, and the House of Commons, which represents the ordinary people. And so people in America look at England's constitution as an ideal to strive for because it has democracy, aristocracy, monarchy, all those elements of government kind of mixed together, and they like it, and they want that for themselves. But in reality, England's government is dominated by patronage and corruption, bribery, favors. People who have lived there for so long, they know guys who know guys who know guys, and you can't get anywhere unless you know a guy, okay? And so for many Americans, they see the opportunity of creating in the Americas the English ideal of government. In the Americas, more people can vote. It's harder for voters to be bought off, to be bribed, to be patronized, okay? The society itself is newer. Everyone kind of has a fresh start. There's a more level playing field. And so a lot of the colonial governments in America take the ideal form of English government and actually try to implement it in existence. Okay, to actually make it real, to make it a reality, to take this ideal fantasy of a balanced democratic government and actually do it in the Americas. Now, technically, all the colonial governments were simply advisory bodies to the royal governors. Okay, the royal governors of the colonies could veto laws, pass laws, do whatever they wanted to. But most of them went along with the colonial assemblies that were elected because, you know, if you just run roughshod over what people want, eventually they're going to get upset. And the royal governors, they have authority, but also that authority is in England, thousands of miles away, separated by the Atlantic Ocean. So if they go too far, you know, things can happen. So they have to kind of thread the needle, and most of the royal governors up until 1760 kind of just let the colonial governments run the show for them. It makes their jobs easier in some ways, okay? Now, they're still technically in charge, but the colonial governments tend to have two house legislatures with an assembly and an upper house or council, okay? The democratically elected assemblies, okay? And the councils sometimes were elected, sometimes were appointed, more roughly approximated the House of Lords, okay? Now, most royal governors tended to just let the colonial legislators do what they wanted to, and they all retained the authority to levy taxes, okay? And the wide ownership of land meant that more than half of the colony's white adult male population could vote. This made it difficult to buy votes. And you see a lot of sort of the beginnings of the American Constitution in those colonial governments. When the representatives of the Constitutional Convention make America's Constitution, they have a lot of experience in government from all these colonial governments, okay? Now, here's the thing though. While the colonies were obsessed in some ways with England, England didn't really think much about the colonies. The colonies were an experiment, an economic enterprise, and they would buy and sell stuff with them. But most English people were far more concerned with what was going on in England and in Europe than they ever were in the Americas. The Americas was a sideshow, okay? No one cares, all right? Yeah, let's let the colonies have their little assembly, whatever, okay? In most respects, the European colonizers, including England, kind of neglected their colonies. But this system of neglect was very, very beneficial to the 13 colonies, okay? This is sometimes called benign neglect. I like to call it salutary neglect. Salutary neglect. You can look that up as you're studying for your test. And I believe this is one of the test questions, either on test 1 or test 2. But salutary neglect is this idea that there's a massive ocean between England and America. It's going to take months to send a message all the way from England to the Americas and back to England, then back to the Americas. If you have a conversation with someone and it takes you 2 to 3 months to get an answer, you kind of have to figure things out on your own, okay? And so the Americans had to form self-government. They could not rely on the English government to tell them what to do for everything because it was practically impossible, okay? Like they couldn't. So the Americas learned to govern themselves. This gives them a great deal of freedom. Even England's regulation of trade rested lightly on the shoulders of most Americans, okay? Now, the royal governments prohibited things, but they didn't have the power to enforce them all, okay? And typically, this policy of benign neglect muddled on to the satisfaction of most people in both sides of the Atlantic, okay? This allowed for the economies to grow. Americans were required, okay, to do things, but they acquired high quality goods at low prices from England, and they got good prices and favorable credit from English banks, English merchants, etc. Okay, so England and America are connected economically, but England doesn't really tell the Americans what to do within their colonies. Once you get onto the Atlantic Ocean and you're trading and back and forth, yes, England cares. America has to trade with England and only with England, with some exceptions. But even then, people could smuggle and get away with it a lot of the time. But as far as controlling within the colonies, the Americans could basically manage themselves. And this led to a growth of a sense of autonomy and a sense of liberty and a sense of independence. And for most of the 1700s, this system, kind of everybody liked it. Most of the people in England didn't really care about the colonies anyways, and the people in the colonies could kind of do whatever they wanted to. And so this system of benign neglect benefited most all the parties involved. But in 1760, really 1754, all of that began to change. And it all began to change because of a young British, or well, he's actually Virginian, a young Virginian militia captain who decided, or colonel, yeah. There was a young officer of the Virginia militia who went on a little expedition into French territory, and he kind of made some people mad. Now, if you know the name of the young Virginia militia officer who in 1754 messed up the whole system of benign neglect because of some interactions he had with the French and their Indian allies, why don't you leave a comment and let me know that you actually watched the video and answer that question. Who was the Virginia militia captain who messed up the system of salutary or benign neglect? Anyways, like I said, I tried to make this video a little bit shorter. Hopefully everyone gets to watch it. Study for your test coming up and make sure that you get your topic selection paragraph to me by Friday, September 18th. And I hope to see you all very soon.